write it down in your notes. What's the interesting symbolism at play? I'm willing to go out onto a ledge, all these stories off the floor, because I want to get to the top. Note the irony. He's convincing himself, dude, you can do this. You can be out there and back in 2 minutes. It ain't no thing. Unless, of course, once you get out there, something might happen. Let's go to work now with the next part of the story, right? Here we go.
On a sudden impulse, he got to his feet, walked to the front closet, and took out an old tweed jacket. It would be cold outside.
Page 123.
He put it on and buttoned it as he crossed the room rapidly toward the open window. In the back of his mind, he knew he'd better hurry and get this over with before he thought too much. And at the window, he didn't allow himself to hesitate. He swung a leg over the sill, then felt for and found the ledge a yard below the window with his foot.
Here we go.
Gripping the bottom of the window frame very tightly and carefully, he slowly ducked his head under it. Feeling on his face the sudden change from the warm air of the room to the chill outside. With infinite care, he brought out his other leg, his mind concentrating on what he was doing. Then he slowly stood erect.
You can see it in your mind's eye, right?
Most of the putty, dried out and brittle, had dropped off the bottom edging of the window frame, he found, and the flat wooden edging provided a good gripping surface, a half-inch or more deep, for the tips of his fingers. Now, balanced easily and firmly, he stood on the ledge outside in the slight chill breeze, 11 stories above the street, staring into his own lighted apartment, odd and different seeming now. First his right hand, then his left. He carefully shifted his fingertip grip from the puttyless window edging to an indented row of bricks directly to his right. It was hard to take the first shuffling sideways step then, to make himself move, and the fear stirred in his stomach, but he did it, again, by not allowing himself time to think. And now, with his chest, stomach, and the left side of his face pressed against the rough, cold brick, his lighted apartment was suddenly gone. And it was much darker out here than he had thought. Without pause, he continued. Right foot, left foot. Right foot, left. His shoe soles shuffling and scraping along the rough stone, never lifting from it, fingers sliding along the exposed edging of brick. He moved on the balls of his feet, heels lifted slightly. The ledge was not quite as wide as he'd expected, but leaning slightly inward toward the face of the building and pressed against it, he could feel his balance firm and secure. And moving along the ledge was quite as easy as he had thought it would be. He could hear the buttons of his jacket scraping steadily along the rough bricks and feel them catch momentarily,
124
at each mortared crack. He simply did not permit himself to look down, though the compulsion to do so never left him. Nor did he allow himself actually to think. Mechanically, right foot, left foot, over and again, he shuffled along crabwise, watching the projecting wall ahead loom steadily closer. Then he reached it, and at the corner, he'd decided how he was going to pick up the paper. He lifted his right foot and placed it carefully on the ledge that ran along the projecting wall at a right angle to the ledge on which his other foot rested. And now, facing the building, he stood in the corner formed by the two walls, one foot on the ledging of each, a hand on the shoulder-high indentation of each wall. His forehead was pressed directly into the corner against the cold bricks. And now he carefully lowered first one hand, then the other, perhaps a foot farther down, to the next indentation in the rows of bricks.
Now, let's just pause for a moment at level 1. Note the genius of this story. In your mind's eye, you can see what he's doing. Crawls out the window, on the ledge, doesn't want to look down, refuses to think, right? No thinking, no thinking, no thinking. Moving, moving, moving. How does he move along the ledge? Does he move looking out towards the street, or does he turn around and he's faced up against the building, right? Faced up against the building. He's got his fingers, he's moving along, and then he gets to where the paper is. Of course, the problem is, how are you going to be able to, standing, reach down and get the paper, knowing that you've got 11 stories behind you? Dude, you fall. You bought the farm, right? It's over. How are you going to get out there and pick this paper up, right? By the way, this is what makes knowing how long the story is interesting. You know how many pages are left in this story. Agree? You know. We said that. This is a long story. You're only a few pages into a story where two things have happened. A piece of paper that matters to this cat has blown out the window, and he crawled out onto a ledge and went, and he got there. Dude, you're there. You're at the paper. He's now at the paper. We got a whole bunch of story left, which begs the obvious question, what's going to happen next? Great story writers are able to create that sense of suspense. I wonder what will happen next. I had a sophomore who grew up here in Orland and had never been to a building that was way up high off the floor. She ended up going to a city, staying in a hotel on the 20th floor, looking out, and got kind of wheezy. And then she remembered this story and she was like, whoa, getting out on that ledge, absolutely freaky. This must have been really important to him, or he wasn't thinking so that he didn't have any of the fear that was involved. All right, very slowly, here we go. Let's pay attention to what happens next.
Very slowly, sliding his forehead down the trough of the brick corner and bending his knees, he lowered his body toward the paper lying between his outstretched feet.
Right?
Again, he lowered his finger holds another foot and bent his knees still more, thigh muscles taut, his forehead sliding and bumping down the brick V.
125.
Half squatting now, he dropped his left hand to the next indentation, and then slowly reached with his right hand toward the paper between his feet. He couldn't quite touch it, and his knees now were pressed against the wall. He could bend them no farther.
Kind of stuck, right?
But by ducking his head another inch lower, the top of his head now pressed against the bricks, he lowered his right shoulder and his fingers had the paper by a corner, pulling it loose. At the same instant, he saw between his legs and far below Lexington Avenue stretched out for miles ahead. He saw in that instant the Lowe's Theater sign, blocks ahead past 50th Street, the miles of traffic signals, all green now, the lights of cars and street lamps, countless neon signs, and the moving black dots of people. And a violent, instantaneous explosion of absolute terror roared through him. For a motionless instant, he saw himself externally, bent practically double, balanced on this narrow ledge, nearly half his body projecting out above the street far below. And he began to tremble violently, panic flaring through his mind and muscles, and he felt the blood rush from the surface of his skin. In the fractional moment before horror paralyzed him as he stared between his legs at that terrible length of street far beneath him, a fragment of his mind raised his body in a spasmodic jerk to an upright position again, but so violently that his head scraped hard against the wall, bouncing off it, and his body swayed outward to the knife edge of balance, and he very nearly plunged backward and fell. Then he was leaning far into the corner again, squeezing and pushing into it, not only his face, but his chest and stomach, his back arching. And his fingertips clung with all the pressure of his pulling arms to the shoulder-high, half-inch indentation in the bricks. He was more than trembling now. His whole body was racked with a violent shuddering beyond control. His eyes squeezed so tightly shut it was painful, though he he was past awareness of that. His teeth were exposed in a frozen grimace, the strength draining like water from his knees and calves. It was extremely likely, he knew, that he would faint.
Right?
To slump down along the wall, his face scraping, and then drop backward. A limp weight out into nothing. And to save his life, he concentrated on holding on to consciousness, drawing deliberate deep breaths of cold air into his lungs, fighting to keep his senses aware. Then he knew that he would not faint. But he could neither stop shaking nor open his eyes. He stood where he was, breathing deeply, trying to hold back the terror of the glimpse he had had of what lay below him.
126.
And he knew he had made a mistake in not making himself stare down at the street, getting used to it and accepting it, when he had first stepped out onto the ledge. It was impossible to walk back.
Uh-oh.
He simply could not do it. He couldn't bring himself to make the slightest movement. The strength was gone from his legs. His shivering hands, numb, cold, and desperately rigid, had lost all deftness. His easy ability to move and balance was gone. Within a step or two, if he tried to move, he knew that he would stumble clumsily and fall.
All right, we call this vertigo, right? That feeling that you have when you know you just are frozen, paralyzed, you can do nothing. Note the interesting mistake that is mentioned. The mistake is that he should have looked down before he went out there. I've had students that say, oh, no. The mistake that he made was going out onto the ledge to go get a piece of paper. That's insane. Why would he do this? Notice, he didn't think about it. And then he got out there. And then he realized the decision that he made it's not about paper at all. Now it's about survival. You could probably jot down in 3B a moment in your life when you've had a similar realization. You did something that was an unthinking decision or choice, and then now that you're there, you go, oh, what have I done? Now I'm out. I've got to survive. I've got to do something, and I got to figure this out. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? By the way, let's just point out at 2B really quickly. Notice the point of view of this story. Is it told from the perspective of Tom standing out on the ledge and the I, first person? No. Told from that third person point of view, omniscient, that's giving us information about what he's thinking. Yes? Which tells us if this was written from the first person I went onto the ledge, I stood out there. While it would give the reader a sense of what it's like to be out on a ledge looking 11 stories up and kind of going, oh, you would know that he survived if it's told from the first person point of view. Yes? In this story, we have no idea what's going to happen. How's a story like this going to end? Let's keep reading. Again, Finney's ability to kind of reach out and grab you as a reader and make you wonder what's going to happen next. We call that, again, suspense, right?
Seconds passed, with the chill, faint wind pressing the side of his face, and he could hear the toned-down volume of the street traffic far beneath him. Again and again, it slowed and then stopped, almost to silence. Then, presently, even this high, he would hear the click of the traffic signals and the subdued roar of the cars starting up again. During a lull in the street sounds, he called out. Then he was shouting, "Help!" so loudly it rasped his throat. But he felt the steady pressure of the wind, moving between his face and the blank wall, snatch up his cries as he uttered them, and he knew they must sound directionless and distant. And he remembered how, habitually, here in New York, he himself heard and ignored shouts in the night. If anyone heard him, there was no sign of it. And presently, Tom Beneke knew he had to try moving. There was nothing else he could do.
Gotta move, right?
Eyes squeezed shut, he watched scenes in his mind like scraps of motion picture film. He could not stop them. He saw himself stumbling suddenly sideways as he crept along the ledge, and saw his upper body arc outward, arms flailing. He saw a dangling shoestring caught between the ledge and the sole of his other shoe, saw a foot start to move, to be stopped with a jerk, and felt his balance leaving him. He saw himself falling with a terrible speed as his body revolved in the air, knees clutched tight to his chest, eyes squeezed shut, moaning softly. Out of utter necessity, knowing that any of these thoughts might be reality in the very next seconds, he was slowly able to shut his mind against every thought but what he now began to do. With fear-soaked slowness, he slid his left foot an inch or two toward his own impossibly distant window. Then he slid the fingers of his shivering left hand a corresponding distance. For a moment, he could not bring himself to lift his right foot from one ledge to the other. Then he did it, and became aware of the harsh exhalation of air from his throat, and realized that he was panting. As his right hand then began to slide along the brick edging, he was astonished to feel the yellow paper pressed to the bricks underneath his stiff fingers, and he uttered a terrible, abrupt bark that might have been a laugh or a moan. He opened his mouth and took the paper in his teeth, pulling it out from under his fingers.
So just go back to it for a second. I want to study how Finney does this on page 126. Just look at the fourth paragraph there on 126 with me. Look at the repetition of sounds in the S sounds. Notice how all five senses are being elicited. What you can feel, what you can taste, what you can hear, all of that. Eyes squeezed shut. He watched scenes in his mind like scraps of motion picture film. Note the irony, that's where his wife is at the film, right? The film that he could have gone to and he didn't. He couldn't stop them. And then watch the repetition of saw. He saw himself, let's look at this line. Look at all the S's. He saw himself stumbling suddenly sideways as he crept along the ledge, and saw his upper body arc outward, arms flailing. He saw a dangling shoestring caught between the ledge and the sole of his other shoe, saw a foot start to move, to be stopped with a jerk, felt his balance leaving him. He saw himself falling with a terrible speed as his body recovered in air, knees clutched tight to his chest, eyes squeezed shut. I had a student once that said as she was reading this, she actually shut her eyes because it's like that feeling of falling that Finney is able to construct. Of course, you almost forget as a reader, oh yeah, we're out here for some stupid yellow piece of paper that has some silliness written on it. The ways in which we find ourselves all of a sudden having a different perspective, right? Let's enjoy it.
By a kind of trick, by concentrating his entire mind on first his left foot, then his left hand, then the other foot, then the other hand, he was able to move, almost imperceptibly, trembling steadily, very nearly without thought. But he could feel the terrible strength of the pent-up horror on just the other side of the flimsy barrier he had erected in his mind. And he knew that if it broke through, he would lose this thin, artificial control of his body. During one slow step, he tried keeping his eyes closed. It made him feel safer, shutting him off a little from the fearful reality of where he was. Then a sudden rush of giddiness swept over him, and he had to open his eyes wide, staring sideways at the cold, rough brick and angled lines of mortar, his cheek tight against the building. He kept his eyes open then, knowing that if he once let them flick outward to stare for an instant at the lighted windows across the street, he would be past help. He didn't know how many dozens of tiny sidling steps he had taken, his chest, belly, and face pressed to the wall. But he knew the slender hold he was keeping on his mind and body was going to break. He had a sudden mental picture of his apartment on just the other side of this wall. Warm, cheerful, incredibly spacious. And he saw himself striding through it, lying down on the floor on his back, arms spread wide, reveling in its unbelievable security. The impossible remoteness of this utter safety, the contrast between it and where he now stood, was more than he could bear. And the barrier broke then, and the fear of the awful height he stood on coursed through his nerves and muscles. A fraction of his mind knew he was going to fall, and he began taking rapid blind steps with no feeling of what he was doing, sidling with a clumsy, desperate swiftness, fingers scrabbling along the brick, almost hopelessly resigned to the sudden backward pull and swift motion outward and down. Then his moving left hand slid onto not brick, but sheer emptiness.
128.
An impossible gap in the face of the wall, and he stumbled.
Uh-oh.
His right foot smashed into his left ankle bone. He staggered sideways, began falling, and the claw of his hand cracked against glass and wood, slid down it, and his fingertips were pressed hard on the puttyless edging of his window. His right hand smacked gropingly beside it as he fell to his knees. And under the full weight and direct downward pull of his sagging body, the open window dropped shudderingly in its frame till it closed and his wrists struck the sill and were jarred off. For a single moment he knelt, knee bones against stone on the very edge of the ledge, body swaying and touching nowhere else, fighting for balance. Then he lost it, his shoulders plunging backward, and he flung his arms forward, his hands smashing against the window casing on either side, and, his body moving backward, his fingers clutched the narrow wood